A story tells of a grandmother who received for her birthday a simple string of pearls from her two granddaughters. Now, it was a bit awkward because Grandma belonged to quite a conservative church. Its members just really didn't wear jewelry. None. But the next morning, as everyone was getting dressed up, the two girls asked her, Grandma, will you wear your new necklace to church? The grandmother didn't know what to do. She didn't want to hurt the kids' feelings, but they weren't really old enough yet to comprehend a Bible study expounding her denomination's teachings on the matter. So she put on the little string of fake pearls, but then tucked them discreetly underneath her coat so that they barely showed. Unfortunately, the family hadn't been at church more than about 2 minutes when another member saw the grandmother and just happened also to spot that necklace peeking out from under the coat. She marched right up to her fellow Christian and announced with a loud voice, "We don't wear those here." With a yank on the necklace, she sent those little pearls scattering all over the church crowded foyer. Well, the two little granddaughters, standing there next to Grandma, took in the entire scene, their eyes opened wide with amazement. Needless to say, those two little girls left the church that morning and never returned. Now, while we don't like such anecdotes, there's no shortage of such experiences in which one person's conscience radically differs from another's. In the Christian church, which is such a marketplace of doctrines, church teachings, opinions, convictions, and causes, how do we all get along? Well, as we move in these morning talks into 1 Corinthians 8, we find Paul dealing directly with this very challenge. What happens when my behavior offends the conscience of someone else? Do I curb my appetite in order to keep the peace? Or do I munch away on a ham sandwich, a big piece of double fudge chocolate cake, and wash it down with 2 Bud Lights at the church potluck, saying to myself as I do so, "If you don't like it, fella, that's your tough luck." Now, the issue in the city of Corinth wasn't Bud Light or going to the movies to see The Exorcist. Back then, and we have to put on our time travel imagination caps to appreciate it, the hot topic of debate wasn't pearl necklaces or neckties. It was food offered to idols. Food that had been part of pagan temple services often found its way into the commercial marketplace. Only small portions of the food would actually be used in the pagan religious ceremonies, and so the heathen temple priests and participants, being of an entrepreneurial spirit, tried to fatten the treasury by selling the leftovers. Many early Christians believed that to eat any of that food in the temple, or even to buy it when it reached the local Safeway, was to somehow participate in idol worship. To take into their bodies even the leftover food used in temple services was to absorb some of the influence of a pagan religion. In fact, in Acts 15, we read how the early Christian church in the days of the disciples actually made a doctrinal determination that eating meat offered to idols was forbidden. James, the leader of the Jerusalem Christian community, the General Conference back then, said, "It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. Instead, we should write to them, telling them to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from the meat of strangled animals, and from blood." That's verses 19 and 20. An interesting tidbit coming from the Jewish Mishnah, that's the Jewish writings of about 200 AD. The Mishnah discusses wine offered to an idol and may give us an idea of how the earliest Christians thought since Christianity came out of Jerusalem. If even the tiniest amount of such wine was mixed with other wine of the same variety, then all of that wine was polluted. But if the wine offered to idols was mixed with a different kind, it was forbidden or disqualified only if the tainted wine imparted or added to the flavor. When you attend a festival, you had no way of knowing if some of that party food had been offered to idols the day before. Or if you went to eat at a friend's house. It was awkward because you couldn't be sure if your host's menu wasn't a bit suspect. Miriam, where'd you get these beef patties? I've got to know. That kind of thing. In fact, some strict Jews who observed the dietary laws carefully wouldn't stop at the open market, but would buy only from a Jewish butcher. Kosher. Everywhere they traveled, they carried their kofinos or basket on their back with an approved lunch. I think you can understand that it wouldn't take long for people to divide into two camps. On one side gathered those who believed and obeyed the rule, whose consciences became attuned to it, and who felt an absolute conviction that everyone should do it that way. On the other hand, quite a number of Christians, including a contingent in the church at Corinth, basically said phooey on that whole thing. This makes no sense. We don't believe in the idols. There are no other gods. Who cares if this food was offered to some meaningless idol last week? It's not worth the spiritual energy it takes to track these things down. We just want to eat and get on with the Lord's work. In their hearts, their consciences, if you will, they saw absolutely nothing wrong with buying and eating good, healthy food from the marketplace without regard to where it had been before. Well, by the time we get down to chapter 8 in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, it's clear that this particular battle had come to his attention. Is it wrong to eat food that was previously offered to idols? Give us your answer, Brother Paul. People kind of leaned over the balcony rail to hear what his answer would be. The answer he presents in this chapter does bring to our attention a clear Bible principle, but listen carefully. It also triggers many thought-provoking questions. We know that an idol is nothing at all in this world and that there is no God but one, he says. In other words, it shouldn't even be an issue. These little gods of wood or stone are meaningless, he writes. They're nothing, and they represent nothing. These so-called entities just plain don't exist. In the Old Testament, we find the word Elilim, meaning nothings. The clear implication then is that food being offered to a nothing is a nothing. It isn't even an issue. Who cares? Say grace and pass the gravy. For the Apostle Paul, who clearly understood the Christian gospel and the idea of freedom in Christ, today we'd say the question was a no-brainer. But then Paul goes right on into a highly important area of study. After his statement about pagan gods being nothing, he says in verse 7, "But not everyone knows this. Some people are still so accustomed to idols that when they eat such food, they think of it as having been sacrificed to an idol, and since their conscience is weak, it is defiled. But food does not bring us near to God. We are no worse if we do not eat, and no better if we do." And then he adds the challenge that we'll consider more deeply in this section. In verse 9, "Be careful, however, that the exercise of your freedom does not become a stumbling block to the weak." Well, right here, about 1,000,000 warning bells go off in your mind. Are there things that you and I do that are absolutely not sinful, absolutely not forbidden, absolutely not in violation of our own consciences, but which would offend someone else's conscience? Yes. It happens every single day in every single church, at every single religious community. You see, no person is an island, we say. And it's just plain not possible to live completely to yourself. Someone's always watching you, and then getting tripped up by what they see. The Greek word proskoma can be translated as stumbling block, stone in the pathway, an obstacle, or simply whatever may trip a person up and make progress difficult. What might it be today? Your necklace offends me, someone says. Take it off. I don't like that music you played at church. You shouldn't be doing that on the Lord's Day. That dress is too revealing. You shouldn't go to the theater to see that film. I mean, we lack no shortage of modern applications. So what do? Do we back down slowly and play it safe every time and everywhere? Do we live a life of unnecessary sterility, tied down by regulations that don't even exist because some weaker Christian says so? To what extent do we hand the reins of our lives over to other Christians in the camp? Stay tuned.